Alright, what is going on, everybody? Christian here, and we're going to do something a little different today for our Magic video. So, this weekend is Regional Championship in Houston, Texas, and the format is Modern. I am not qualified or going myself. Since I moved to Vegas, I have not really played any locally, and while I will not be in Vegas that much longer, I'm probably going to only plan to LCQ for the RC that is here next month, and I'll start kind of hitting the local scene pretty hard again, I think, next season when I'm back home. But for the time being, I think I'm probably going to stream uh, the RC tomorrow if anybody's wanting to hang out. But I wanted to kind of do a primer for what people can expect. I still kind of keep very close to the pulse of all of the formats and what's going on, even if I'm not actively playing locally. And yeah, I think that Modern looks pretty fantastic at the moment. I think there's a lot kind of to go over and talk about. It helps that we just had a Pro Tour a couple weeks ago over the format. Though, spoiler, I don't actually think the Pro Tour meta will be that indicative of the RC meta. But yeah, let's go ahead and get into it. So what I have up here this is, for those of you that are not in the know, this is MTG Goldfish. And this is a website that pulls data from Magic Online results and compiles them into, as you can see, it's, share of the meta, and all of the different lists that fall under that umbrella of archetype. So, in the last 30 days, on the Magic Online metagame specifically, you've got the most played 5 decks as Goryo's, Boros Energy, Belcher, Affinity, Domain Zoo, with the percentages being set up in a way where Eldrazi Tron is effectively in the top 5. I would say these are all reasonably interchangeable, and then you don't have the next drop-off until Amulet Titan at 7. A couple things to note. Unlike the real-life metagame, where card availability is a bit more of an issue, especially at the local level, which is kind of what the regional championships support, people are less likely to change decks. Obviously, there are people that have the ability to change between multiple decks, but most people will kind of just bring the cards that they have, right, that they won with, the decks that they like, etc. So, a big open event in person like the RC is going to be a lot harder to pinpoint the expected metagame. So what that means for you, if you happen to be one of the players that are attending this weekend, I think it's very important to have a very linear plan that you can do against everybody. And that doesn't necessarily mean be aggro or combo, right? The blue-white control decks in this format have a very linear plan of play very cheap, efficient counter magic that is universal against everybody. And then you can kind of lock everybody out with your Isochron Scepter plan, or just outdraw them with all of your card draw, right? That plan is linear and works against everybody. It doesn't necessarily have to be an aggressive concept. But kind of one of the changes that I wanted to mostly discuss is the Pro Tour results had Belcher as the winner and Goryo's as the most played archetype. I suspect that will not be the case for this event. I would still suspect Boros Energy to be the number 1 most played deck, and a couple reasons for that. Generally speaking, players gravitate to the more mid-range shells. Boros Energy has been around since MH3, so people have had a lot of time to acquire the cards, a lot of chances to play the deck and get a lot of reps with it. And that strikes me as a very safe, high-powered option for people to bring in person. Belcher, even though it won the Pro Tour, I actually kind of suspect Belcher to have a reasonably poor showing. Throughout Magic's history, usually if an unfair deck wins the event, even if the deck is pretty resilient, which I think Belcher is quite resilient, to be fair, I don't think it's quite as susceptible to hate as maybe some people would have you believe. I do think that hate for Belcher might be overrepresented for the amount of people that were playing it, right? I think Belcher will only probably be in that like 5 to 7, 5 to 8% of the meta. And you're going to have a lot of opponents that probably have anywhere between 3 to 7 cards against you. And that poses a problem, right? Whereas if you're playing something like a little more off the beaten path, like say you're a mill enjoyer, there probably aren't going to be that many, random Emrakuls and stuff floating around that cause you a lot of particular problems, right? Belcher is unfortunately probably going to have a lot of cards similar to like the Knight of the White Orchid angle where they're pretty much only there to interact with that deck, right? So I've suspected that Belcher will perform probably under expectation, that Boros will be the most played deck. I suspect Affinity will also underperform. In my experience, this deck is very reliant on its powerful draws and doesn't have a lot of ways to fight the fair game when it has the dysfunctional draws, right? So because you're kind of forced to play a bunch of opals and a bunch of very low-powered zero-mana artifacts, mulliganing is particularly bad for you because you kind of operate on a critical mass. And if you don't open up on an exact 7 that kind of like lets you vomit onto the board very early, I think it's going to be very hard for you to put out enough pressure to beat the unfair decks or to elongate the games against the mid-range decks, right? Like, against Boros Energy, for example, if you get a very good draw as the Affinity player against Boros Energy, yeah, I don't think that they interact with cards like Kappa Cannoneer very well, right? I think that you can win those games quite easily. But if you stumble at all and have to play a fair mid-range game against them, you're never winning, right? They're going to win that fight every time. Domain Zoo is actually probably the aggro deck that I predict will have the best turnout of the weekend. I think the combination of very consistent, cheap, powerful threats backed by removal and permission, it's just very hard to go wrong with that, right? So you end up in this world where, as the Affinity deck, you need probably 4 or 5 cards specifically in your opening hand to be able to initiate a clock that's relevant. That's kind of just like not true for Zoo. Obviously, you have the Leyline Scion draws where you get off the ground significantly faster, but you can win games very easily. Again, with just turn 1 Ragavan into turn 2 Counterspell via Stubborn Denial, Leyline Binding, Tribal Flames to get the blocker out of the way. It's just much easier for you to play a real game as the aggro deck. You need less to go your way. I also suspect Eldrazi Tron will have a pretty good showing. The logic being, I think it just goes over the top of all of these other creature-centric decks. My suspicion is that Boros Energy, Affinity, and Zoo, none of them want to play against Eldrazi Tron. Affinity definitely doesn't, right, because of Karn. And then Eldrazi Tron, I think, is probably not that bad against Belcher either, right? Again, Karn is an example. But you just create so many kind of like board stall-y potential outcomes that you put a lot of pressure on the decks to be able to have that exact piece of interaction to deal with you, or the threats that you're playing just on average, on curve, are just going to be so much more powerful. I kind of think the same for Goryo's as opposed to, or like in combination with Belcher. I think your good draws are still going to win games very easily. And it's going to look like the most powerful deck in the format when it works right. Goryo's Vengeance, I was a Goryo's Vengeance enjoyer for quite a while in previous formats. And when Goryo's works, it looks like the most unreasonable deck, right? Because it has that Temur Rhinos angle of, because your combo card is an instant, you can actually just play your combo piece at end step and then fight over it with Force of Negation. And that ends up just being a really, really potent combination. And because the deck requires like very exact resources to line up, when it works, the deck is going to look unbeatable. But the deck flounders a lot because it has a lot of these ephemerate, solitude-y angles as well, that when you're not doing the powerful reanimator thing, you don't really have a real mid-range game to fall back on. It tries to do the ephemerate Riddler thing that a lot of the blue-white mid-range decks are starting to popularize. But the problem is a lot of decks are powerful enough to go around that if you're floundering on your actual combo. And then in 7th, we have Titan, which is actually my pick as probably the deck that is likely to perform the best for a couple reasons. One, I do actually just think it is the most generically powerful deck in the format that also, I don't want to say can't be hated against, but that is hated against. Like how I said with Belcher, you're kind of public enemy number one, and a lot of people are playing a lot of cards in their sideboard to deal with you. I think that's less true in Titan. I think Titan hate, for the most part, is at a pretty low count. And then in addition to that, it's the kind of deck that a lot of the best players in the room are going to gravitate towards. So that skews the results and kind of my opinion on the deck a decent bit. But yes, I do expect Amulet Titan to be the best performing deck, probably have the best conversion rate of people that play it in day one, that convert to day two, etc. And then you get into some of these other decks like Neobrand and Izzet Prowess that are certainly good enough to make a stand in the format. Prowess more so than Neobrand. Neobrand, a little gimmicky, has some matchups that I think it lines up very well against, in particular Titan being one of those. I think that's probably the only deck in the format Titan actively wants to avoid. And then you have Prowess, which is going to be just like your very generic example of kind of like aggro tempo beatdown, right? You're still rocking the Swiss Spears. You've got the Steel Cutters. A lot of them are going towards Slick Shot Show Off. And with the addition of Violent Urge into a lot of those decks, to me, they feel a lot more combo-y than kind of like aggro or mid-range. You know, in previous iterations of Izzet Prowess, before the bannings, you kind of leaned on Breach as your mid-game enabler. Now, they've kind of dodged all of that. The only card advantage engine they tend to play is EI, Expressive Iteration. And they're just trying to combo you out with Violent Urge and Burn Spells, right? Lava Darts and Lightning Bolts to go with all of their cheap creatures. Yeah, so back to Titan on that front, since that's been kind of my pick to be the deck that functions the best, that performs the best. I kind of, another reason that I think that that's the case is Amulet just gets to kind of play these cards that are very, very problematic, right? So, whereas Eldrazi Tron has cards like Karn, that are just going to completely shut down something like Goryo's or Belcher if they resolve, right? Because of the cards that they have access to in the sideboard. Amulet, with the current iterations people are playing, kind of can go around anything. So you still have the robust turn 2, turn 3 win draws. But because a lot of lists have gravitated to like the Ice Till, you can kind of see it's just the old plan of interacting with their lands. Like, maybe you hit an Urza Saga or something. That win condition just kind of doesn't exist anymore. Green Sun Zenith, shocker, it used to be on the ban list, right? Green Sun Zenith just ends up being an incredibly versatile card that just makes the deck basically immune to hate. Because if you're bringing in all of these cards to interact with the land combo, either they're just going to Ice Till the lands back, or they're just going to beat you with, like, Tireless Trackers and hard other creatures, right? They don't actually need their lands to beat you anymore. So it puts a lot of pressure on your draw if you're an aggressive deck, for example, to have all of your hate and a very good clock. And if you're missing either piece of that, they're just gonna outrange you in the long game. So yeah, no, I think this breakdown reasonably consistent for what you can expect to see at the RC. But yeah, there's a lot of just other factors going on, and I'm really excited personally to see how the format shakes out. I think any of these decks can have a very good showing. I don't think any of these like top 10 decks, or even, you can go further down, right? You have Esper mid-range, which is going to be closer to your blue-white Thalia Riddler style deck. And then you have Jeskai Control, which is just blue-white control, right? It's just for the sideboard, probably some sideboard cards. But any of these decks are in range of being able to have a good performance based on the player and the prep, of course. That's always true. But yeah, Modern is an excellent format, and as you can see from the layout, you could pretty much find any deck that is kind of on brand with you, right, as a player, kind of your preferred archetype, and there is a tier 1 version of that, right? I think all of these 7, I would actually say 8, I would be confident in saying all 8 of these decks are in the same tier of power, I think. Maybe like something like Belcher or Amulet are a little more degenerate, but I think it is possible to hate out Belcher enough that it puts it in the same tier as all of these other decks. So yeah, that's kind of what we're looking forward to tomorrow. And I think it's going to be a great event. I'm going to have the absolute worst case of FOMO, but I've got some buddies there that I'll be rooting for. And yeah, that is going to do it for us today. If you like this kind of content and just basically me yapping, let me know. I would appreciate all the feedback. And you guys have a good one. Peace!